All right. Hello and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology live with your professor, Dr. Shawn Clavell. For those of you that are regular attenders to the live feed, I apologize as we head into the last week into spring break, but I had to pre-record these announcements here as we had so much to work on. I'm getting so much material set up for you guys here for this last week to get you guys get it in your head before you leave me here for the next week during spring break. So just kind of I want to first congratulate you guys, right, on finishing the skeletal system. So we just wrapped up the skeletal system. We finished uh, the bones of the body, and now we are moving on into the muscular system. This section will also encompass movement, right? So movement of the body. Uh, Pop up a little schedule here as we take a look. There's the schedule. We're here in week 11. That's encompassing, March 25th through the 29th, I want to say, that type of week here. We're looking primarily we've just finished the skeletal system, and now we're looking at joints, articulations, and body movements. Joints, articulations, and body movements. Then I'm going to try and get the muscular system as much as the muscular system lodged into your heads and brains before you guys go for the week, and then we come back, finish up talking about the muscular system for our exam there 2 weeks after the break. So kind of it's 4 weeks, 3 or 4 weeks here for the next exam, but we also have spring break there. But again, I would totally encourage you guys to keep working throughout the break here on some of these muscles, and that's why I want to kind of go over this, give you a preface as to what you're going to be seeing here over the next couple of chapters here. So first, as you see, I've been producing some new material throughout your modules, and I'll have some new modules here for going to go to the here. So again, you've got chapter 9, articulations, joints, and movement. So you guys are going to look at articulations, joints, and movement. Particularly, let's kind of run it through here. That's a chapter 10. And so when we look at that, let me see if I can't throw this picture up there. Okay. So if we're looking at particularly as it relates to, chapter 10, joints and movements, and so the first topic area is the types of joints. So really kind of like how much movement is available. The joint is defined by two bones coming together, and so two bones come together in the skull and they don't really move. Two bones come together in the shoulder and there's a lot of movement. So there's types of joints. There's two types of classifications. So there's the functional versus structural classification of joints. And so, one, and particularly, we like to talk here about the structural classification. And there's three different types of structural classifications. There's these fibrous joints. They tend to be not as movable. There are cartilaginous joints, and they have they can range in movement from little to no movement, but synovial joints are really the joints that are related to movement and take over this chapter in chapter 10. So you talk about these synovial joints, give that a little bit bigger of a picture there, give it the underline as well, because it's these synovial joints that are responsible for movement. And so we look at the form and function of each of these different synovial joints. So again, as you can see here, we were talking about the types of joints. We talk about the synovial joints particularly, but then there's the types or subtypes of 6 types, let's put it that way. 6 types of synovial joints. And so, what are those 6 types of joints? We're talking here about let's see if I can't pop this out here for you, grab you some slides here to kind of correlate with what I'm talking about. But what are the 6 types of synovial joints that allow for the different types of movement? And then ultimately, then we talk about those specific types of movement, right? So first we can kind of talk about the now that I got my slides here, we can talk about the fibrous joints. Remember, we talked about those fibrous joints. They're held together by fibrous connective tissue. Cartilaginous joints held together by cartilage, and then synovial joints, right, have a fluid-filled cavity. There are many structures that you should also be associating with those different with synovial joints, and so that's kind of what we're looking at. Then we get into the 6 types of synovial joints, and that's that next section here. These different types of synovial joints allow for different movement. Against the best example here is, like our ball and socket joint allows for all the movement available: flexion, extension, abduction, and uh, abduction, adduction, as well as internal and external rotation. This occurs at the hip and at the shoulder. And so, really, that's where we come into our next point here, which is body movements. So, identifying and being able to identify each of the body movements related to the human body, right? So, whether it's flexion and extension, ab and adduction, or even some of the rotation motions, what are each of those? What are the each of the what are the each of the movements that occur at each of these joints? So you can imagine you might have pictures that relate to, internal, external rotation, head or neck flexion, and you would have to describe those motions. And so that's the big section or the big takeaway when it comes to chapter 10, right? We're definitely going to talk about the different types of joints. So the synovial joints take main stage shortly after we talk about that. But then also the big one here that we're going to talk about is uh, movement. And so again, this is where we talk about specifically what joint are we talking about. So you could say like, i.e., shoulder flexion. What does shoulder flexion look like? Could you identify shoulder flexion? Could you describe shoulder flexion? Another one might be let's pick another hip abduction, right? Hip abduction. What does that look like, and how would you describe that? So, chapter 10, joints and movements, really structural and functional and structural classifications. There's 3 types of joints. There's this fibrous joint, cartilaginous joint, and synovial joints. And then specifically, those synovial joints are related to movement. So there's a couple of types of, a couple of shapes related to them. And so, what are those shapes? And ultimately, what are the movements that are associated at each joint? It's a big chapter, but it's a fun chapter nonetheless. When we look at chapter 11, let's open up a new slide here for you. As we look at chapter 11, what you're going to talk about here is specifically the muscle tissue. So, chapter 11, muscle tissue. It's very similar to what we saw when we talked about the bone as a tissue. So, the histology of muscle tissue. So, this is chapter, I'm sorry, chapter 9 and 10. Okay, so muscles and joints is 10. This is chapter 10 as well, we'll just say. And so we're talking about histology, so microscopic anatomy of muscles, whether it's, again, there's different types of muscles. So there's cardiac muscle, there is skeletal muscle, and skeletal muscle is related to movement. And then there is smooth muscle tissue. Once we identify muscle under a microscope, or histology of muscle, that's when skeletal muscle takes center stage. So skeletal muscle will take center stage, and the big component of that is going to be a skeletal muscle contraction, or the stages of a skeletal muscle contraction. So what are the stages of a skeletal muscle contraction? Well, I'll generally just kind of give you a kind of a gross overview. There's the first component, which is called the events at the neuromuscular junction. And so, every muscle is stimulated by a nerve. And so, what are the events that occur at the junction point between the nerve and the muscle, the neuromuscular junction? This is also sometimes referred to as excitation, right? How do you stimulate the muscle to start a contraction? The next one here is excitation, contraction, coupling. Excitation, contraction, coupling is, as you might start to think here, the stages or the steps that are related to going from the neuromuscular stimulation to the actual starting of a contraction, where these proteins start to slide amongst each other. It's referred to as the sliding filament theory. But ultimately, that leads to what's called this cross bridge cycle. And the cross bridge cycle is this cycle of events that actually cause the proteins to slide, causes a muscle to contract. So, and I tell you this because over the next few days and weeks, I encourage you to look these things up, right? Like Google it a little bit, take some other perspectives in terms of the stages of a muscle contraction. So you can say, Google events at the neuromuscular conjunction. You could Google or look up the excitation, contraction, coupling. And you could Google force production, and that's what we're looking at. So, chapter 10, again, looks primarily at the concepts of skeletal muscle histology, skeletal muscle contraction, and muscle twitch. Finally, in chapter 11, this is kind of where the rote memorization is going to come into. So remember when we looked at the bones of the body here? In chapter 11, we are going to talk about all of the specific skeletal, the insertion. Where does the muscle end? And then finally, the action of that muscle. So, what is the muscular action, right? So, this is kind of a combination of the structures of that are associated with it. So, what we ultimately will see, and I'll reference this in those lectures. What you'll also see is that these muscles contract, and they kind of have a line of pull, meaning they pull in a direction that makes them that allows for different movements at the joints. So the action is the other component of what you'd be able to identify in terms of these muscles. I got a couple of pictures here as I open up these slides. So let's take a very common muscle. Let's take a muscle like, I don't know, the biceps. Biceps brachii is a muscle that attaches into the arm. And so, if I can find it, it has two attachment points. That's why we get the reference bi. But the muscle here is. Hold it further. I just skipped it. There it is. There it is. Okay. So let's take like your biceps for an instance, right? Your biceps has two attachment points. So the first one is the coracoid process of the scapula. That is right. There's the coracoid process of the scapula. There's another insertion down. It's kind of right there in the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula as well. Just above the glenoid fossa is a tubercle. It's called the supraglenoid tubercle. So again, it attaches to the coracoid process of the scapula, the glenoid tubercle of the scapula, and then runs all the way down towards its insertion point, which is that of the draw it right here for you. That of the radial tuberosity. The radial tuberosity, again, located on the radius. And so the action of this muscle, most commonly, is that it is a elbow flexor as well as a forearm supinator. So it supinates the arm, flexes the arm, right? This is a muscle that is responsible for elbow flexion. Let me see if I have an example of it for us to see here. here. Right, so elbow flexion, you can see how it pulls on the bone to cause the elbow to flex. It's a prime mover, as it might be referred to, or an agonist for elbow flexion. So the biceps contracting and relaxing there, responsible for elbow flexion. So that's the concept that we're looking at here. You should be able to identify these muscles, be able to identify their if they're on a chart, just like if I showed you the picture, any of those pictures that you see there on the slides. What is their origin, what is their insertion, and what is their action? And so my list, I have my list of muscles here. Let's just get to your canvas, and at the bottom of your canvas you have a list that's called the Muscle Master List. The Muscle Master List is the list of muscles that you will be asked to identify, to use, to know, as it relates to the muscular system here in this semester. So the Muscle Master List, gives it a second to download, right? But the Muscle Master List is going to be where you find the list of muscles that you'll be asked to know. Again, origin, insertion, and action of each of these muscles. Try that one more time. But again, as you can see here, I am recording some brand new material, getting some new stuff for you here, fresh off the presses. So, save it. So, thank you again for your time, your patience. Congratulations here on the so far moving through the semester. You guys are doing great. I encourage you guys to keep up the hard work even through the spring break. I know it's hard, but we're almost there. You guys are doing awesome. I look forward to all of your responses in the upcoming lab assignments and exams. But until then, you guys take care, and I will talk to you soon.